Did the Chancellor, or the Prime Minister for that matter, mislead the public when it came to the budget? I know it's a really big suggestion, but what we're going to do in the next few minutes is just run through some of the evidence and, well, you can make your own mind up here. We'll start, okay, with this is what Keir Starmer just said to my colleague Beth Rigby. She asked whether there was any misleading of the public, and we'll come back to what the misleading is about in a moment. Look, he said, there was no misleading. I simply don't accept that. And then he went on to say, I was receiving the numbers, being told that the OBR productivity review means you've got £16 billion less than you would otherwise have had. £16 billion less. It's worth just dwelling on that for a moment, okay? Basically, to translate, the Prime Minister is implying that the key thing in the run-up to the budget, that kind of this big tax-raising budget, was that the OBR stepped in and said, you haven't got enough money. So was that actually true? We'll start, okay, by just doing the very big picture. And this is kind of helpful because ultimately this boils, there's so much talk about headroom and all of this other stuff. But ultimately what this boils down to is the fact that the government, the state, spends a lot of money. That's your departmental spending, welfare spending, debt interest spending. But it also brings in a lot of money in terms of income tax, VAT and other taxes. And the key thing that the Chancellor it's a rule that she set herself, is that she wants, by the end of the Parliament, this bar to be higher than that bar. So your tax receipts to be higher than spending when you adjust for where you are in the political cycle and you ignore things like investment. And actually, we are heading for that being met, or at least last time around, she was heading for that being met, for there to be a current budget surplus of £9.9 billion. I know the gap between those is a bit bigger, but this is just when you adjust for the state of the public finances and the economic cycle. £9.9 billion. That's the difference, okay? Key thing. That is the headroom that a lot of people kind of talk about. And if the Prime Minister is right, that the OBR has just stepped in and said, no, £16 billion downgrade, then look at that. All of a sudden, that's gone, hasn't it? So if it's a £16 billion downgrade from the OBR, then that is wiped out. You've broken your fiscal rules and you've got to raise taxes. It would be pretty catastrophic if that were the case. So was that the case? In short, no. This is basically what actually happened. So these are the numbers we actually got from the Office of Budget Responsibility. That was the headroom in March. They came out and said, yeah, we have looked at the economy again and we're downgrading it, but we're downgrading it by £6 billion. Actually, it's more like kind of £5 and a bit billion, 5.5 billion or so. That's a very different picture, isn't it? Because all of a sudden, you're not breaking your fiscal rules. And you can make the case about whether you kind of want to get that up, but that's a choice. So it's worth just, pondering. Why is there such a big difference here between the 6 billion I'm talking about and the 16 billion the Prime Minister's talking about? Not just once, but not just twice, but again and again and again in that press conference, because this is a question of misleading about the state of the economy and about those decisions in the budget. We'll come back to that in a second, but the key thing to note here is that over the course of the summer, the Office of Budget Responsibility did a big exercise. It looked at the state of the economy, it looked at just how fast we're growing, it looked at whether that was going to mean there was more or less tax revenue coming in to the government's coffers. And when you do an exercise like that, you have to look at a lot of things. You look at productivity, but you look at inflation, you look at wage inflation, you look at how much money is being generated. All of those things have an impact. One part of it, yes, is productivity. So there was one element of this review that looked at productivity and said, on its own, productivity is weaker, that's £16 billion down, but like I say, that was only one part of it. You've also got to take account of inflation. You've got to take account of other things, the economy being more tax-rich, other effects. And it turns out that when you bear all that other stuff in mind, that goes up, and that goes up, and that goes up. And actually, it's not a £16 million hit. It's £16 million extra coming in. Now, that's not the full story, because on top of that, that's the extra revenue you might be bringing in. But then you've got to look at the extra spending. So we've got higher debt interest, you've got things like special educational needs, they weren't properly accounted for before. So take that into account, and then that is wiped out essentially, and you're down to £6 billion. So you see, like normally we don't go into the weeds of this quite so much. But the Prime Minister was just quoting that without referring to any of this stuff. And this is the key, that is the key number. It's £6 billion. It's not £16 billion, when you're looking at the final net result. And this matters because back to this, okay, the headroom was there. It's ground down by this productivity review, definitely ground down by £6 billion, but it's not ground down as much as the Prime Minister is implying. And critically, we are not at the point there where you've broken your rules. So whether you're going to raise taxes at that point, it's a decision, it's a choice. And this is kind of what this comes back to. That is non-discretionary. That's basically a forecast change. What really happened and what really pushed the kind of government's accounts into the red, so it would have been missing its fiscal rules, were the U-turns, those welfare U-turns that we had over the course of the summer. That was £7 billion. So more than the OBR downgrade. That took them down, so the fiscal rules were broken. Put on top of that the fact that you've got extra decisions, so welfare measures, that's the two-child policy, that pushes it further down. So the OBR thing was only small or more smaller in relation to those decisions, choices the government made. It was a choice to do that. It wasn't about the OBR. And it was a choice to go from there to raise taxes an awful lot, £26 billion. It's one of the biggest tax rates, not as big as the last time, but a really big tax raising budget, to get up so that there is more headroom than last time around. Again, might well be the right decision, but it's a decision. It wasn't just something imposed on them by the OBR. And that's the critical thing. That's that question of misleading. Is it all to blame on the OBR? That's kind of the impression you would have been left with by the Prime Minister today. And it's kind of the impression that we've been left with for quite a long time. So if we go back to that Prime Minister quote, a better, kind of more accurate, dare I say, way of putting it is not the productivity review means you've got £16 billion less. It's £6 billion less. Big difference. And let's also add, that is smaller than the cost of the welfare U-turns over the summer. So that is where we are at the moment. Worth just asking the question, though, because this is not the first time that the government has implied that the OBR productivity review has had a big bearing on what's going on in the budget. In fact, we've been told that for quite some time. And this is just kind of a little bit of a chronology, going back over the course of the summer, to remind you of the number of times we have been basically told that, and at what point did the Chancellor actually know? Because it's true, there was a point earlier in the summer where it did look like that downgrade was going to be pretty grisly, where it looked like it might well be 16 or maybe 20 billion pounds in terms of the downgrade. So in August the 7th, that's when the OBR kind of stepped in and said to the Chancellor, look, this is what we're doing, and it could be quite big. So at this point, definitely, there were alarm bells ringing in the Treasury. But then, roll on another month, and actually the OBR says, no, look, the bad news is going to be outweighed by better news elsewhere. In other words, those blue bars I showed you earlier. So at this point, it's starting to look better. So you might have thought at this point the government might stop going on about tax rises, but actually, no, that's not what happened. October the 31st, that is when the OBR locks down its forecasts. And at that point, it said to the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, definitively, you're not going to break your fiscal rules because of this downgrade. At that point. Note that, we're just going to mark that in there. So that was when the forecasts were locked down. But here's what's interesting. What's interesting is what happened after that. So after the Prime Minister and the Chancellor knew that they weren't going to break the rules because of the OBR, they did that famous press conference, the press conference where they hinted that they might well have to raise income taxes. And what did the Chancellor do in that press conference repeatedly? She name-checked the OBR. She said, basically, the forecasts aren't looking good. We're going to have to look at this. And then there were more leaks and briefings. And then finally, a couple of weeks later, the income tax rise is ditched. That's, at least, was the story that came out. And you can see at that point, look at what happened to gilt yields. So that's people in the markets responding and going, oh, God, what's going on here? So it's a bit of a roller coaster. The day after that, you had officials from the Treasury coming in and briefing people that the forecasts had improved at the last minute, and that was why they weren't necessarily doing an income tax rise. But that doesn't sound right, does it? Because she knew at this point, she knew then that the OBR forecast hadn't knocked out her fiscal rules, and yet that was when she did the press conference. So put it all together, and it is, I've got to say, a little bit rum, shall we say, given you've had this roller coaster, given what we know now, and also, I think more than anything else, given that even now the Prime Minister and the Chancellor are insisting that so many of those difficult decisions in the budget were more down to the OBR than kind of what they were, which was their own decisions.